Cheryl, welcome to the Brothers on Books podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great book. We really enjoyed it. Why don't we get right into it? Can you paint a picture for us? 9/11. What was going in your world, and how did you get down the rabbit hole of big pharma?
I wasn't even on that radar because we have medical reporters at CBS where I was working at the time that cover those stories typically. But it turned out that I got assigned to cover after 9/11 the restart of the smallpox vaccine program in the United States, because there was a thought that terrorists could now use smallpox to weaponize it, and we need to be protected and restart the smallpox vaccine program. Seemed innocent enough, and I didn't understand what kind of controversy there was behind vaccines, behind this program in particular. My own child was fully vaccinated. I was, if anything, over vaccinated for the same thing over and over again to travel with the military as a reporter. And I didn't know anything about the mechanism of vaccines and how they work. And I was pretty naive about the medical establishment in general. But in covering the restart of the smallpox vaccine program and the health effects that eventually had the whole program deep sixed, because people were dying from it and having heart attacks, really made me understand what was going on, and there was a lot more than meets the eye, not just about the smallpox vaccine program, but about vaccines in general.
Can you also paint a picture of, you brought up Biogen introducing this Aduhelm, I think, and how I guess the advisory board said no to it, but the FDA still approved it. Can you walk us through that?
I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know what you're referring to.
It was, I might be mispronouncing the drug. Aduhelm?
Oh, Aduhelm. Okay.
Aduhelm.
Sorry. So fast forward to decades later, now I've been covering not just vaccine scandals, but the scandals and the misinformation that permeates throughout the medical establishment. And more recently, controversy surrounded the drug Aduhelm, which was touted to be, by the maker of the drug, the first possibly cure for Alzheimer's. Although really nobody really thought it was that, including all of the FDA advisors that met that said this drug shouldn't have been approved and had no evidence that it worked and could have serious side effects. And yet the FDA approved it anyway over the advice of all of its outside advisors. That's happened more than once. And this was something that if it had happened maybe 10, 15 years ago, it just would have shocked everybody. Now it is a scandal, but not many people are talking about it, partly because, as I've written about, the media doesn't cover these medical scandals that have to do with pharmaceutical companies and drugs, in part because the media makes so much money off of these companies. I believe they purposely avoid some of the most important news coverage that they could be doing that impacts the health of Americans.
Mm-hmm. I guess in response to that, I vaguely remember when that was happening that the general belief was just what is the harm of approving the drug? I guess, did you hear anything of that, or do you think it's all just tied, I guess, to money?
Yeah, I mean, the harm or the potential harm has to do with, first of all, let's talk about cost. This was tens of thousands of dollars per year that was now going to be paid by taxpayers, because most of these patients who would be getting it would be on Medicare. And if all the people who supposedly had Alzheimer's were prescribed a drug that didn't work for Alzheimer's, it would quickly bankrupt the entire Medicare system. That was, a financial issue. Number two, all drugs have side effects, and this one had some very serious side effects on the radar. So it's a very careful, or should be a careful calculation anytime the FDA approves a drug, as to whether the potential benefits outweigh the potential risks. And the FDA advisors said, no, they don't in this case. The potential risks, actually the proven risks with this particular drug, has to do with brain bleeding and death, which has been experienced by some patients. So the idea that it's really not possible, according to the way medicine works, to give a medicine that's innocuous and causes nothing in the hope that maybe it could do something good, because even the harshest supporter, the harshest critics agree with the most ardent supporters of drugs. All of them have side effects. And you don't just take that lightly.
On the Medicare topic, when I was reading your book, I, I mean, and you can clarify this, but like, are you kind of describing like that drug companies are like specifically targeting like things that would fall under Medicare? And then like along those lines, like what do you think would happen if we just got rid of Medicare in the pharma playing field?
Well, I think that's a fascinating question. And I would expand that to say, what would happen if we didn't have insurance? The whole notion of Obamacare didn't make sense to me. The idea that we're going to cure our problems and the health costs by giving insurance to everybody, that's sort of like saying, we're just going to make a way for everybody to pay for the exorbitant costs. It doesn't handle the exorbitant costs. So if Medicare covers drugs, the companies lobby Medicare and politicians so that they'll cover their drug. They pay them money and donations and nice things so that the politicians will say, yes, we love your drug, we're going to cover it. And the people who lose are the taxpayers if it's priced too high, which it frequently is. It's priced way higher in this country than the same medicines are in other countries because we have insurance and Medicare that will pay it, Medicaid too. So there's a school of thought that I tend to agree with based on what I've seen, that the fact that people have insurance and Medicare and Medicaid makes it where the drug companies can charge whatever they want, as well as other healthcare companies, and they know it'll get paid. If we didn't have these tools, there would be more market forces at play because nobody could afford to pay $10,000 for one injection for some kind of medicine. So therefore the price would come down to something more reasonable or they wouldn't sell any of the drug. I think that's why during Obamacare, and again, my cognitive dissonance was saying, how is this going to solve problems? Our costs have gone up exponentially since the Affordable Care Act, but the people driving and the people behind wanting insurance for all are the very companies making so much money off of us now.
Do you think there would be as much if there, I guess if the companies couldn't charge as much, so I guess what you just said, they wouldn't be able to sell the drug. Do you think there would be as many drugs that come onto the market?
Probably not. I mean, there would have to be an entirely different calculation that actually had to do more with patient need and drugs being researched for the purposes of what needs are out there versus what they can make money off of. One example people like to point to is there are all kinds of drugs in development for losing weight, diet drugs. And I will point out there's never been one that's effective that hasn't been pulled from the market ultimately for safety reasons. These typically cause heart attacks and other problems. Hopefully Ozempic will be different, but every other one has been pulled ultimately for safety reasons. But there aren't drugs in development to handle some of the most vexing and problematic things that we suffer because not as much money they calculate can be made from those. And that shouldn't be the calculation. I mean, ideally, when we're talking about a public health system, research should be put into drugs that are needed by society, not necessarily the ones that the drug makers think they can make the most money off of. The government now, because the government is one and the same with the pharmaceutical industry, as far as I'm concerned, they promote this system where we are likely to get more and more drugs that don't necessarily improve what we already have on the market, but they can make more money versus drugs we may really need. And then looking at another level, how about not drugs at all? How about solutions that get at the heart of why we're experiencing this explosion in disorders? Instead of just treating it, creating these new markets for it, how about getting at the heart of what's causing it? Because there are causes that can be figured out. When in the span of 1 and 2 generations, we have chronic health disorders that never hardly even used to exist coming on the scene. We can figure out what exposures have led to this, but no one's trying because there's no money right now. There's no money in it. And then public health, which should be looking at things like that, regardless of money and profit, they're not looking at it either because they're too tied into the industries.
I guess
Go ahead, Al.
so. Ozempic, I guess you brought up Ozempic. Ozempic is in fact a diabetes drug, though, correct?
I haven't studied it. I do believe it's created for diabetes, but I believe there's a version, is it Wegovy,
Yeah.
that's given for the weight, the indication of the weight loss. So I think it was invented as a diabetes drug, and it has another indication as well that it's become popularized for.
Yeah, I mean, everyone wants it for the weight from
Right.
what I talked with one of my doctor friends a while back about this, and he was saying that if you have diabetes, you need it, but the weight loss is probably, you should not be using it for weight loss.
Well,
Um,
there's, as I said, everybody knows every drug has side effects. We won't know about all the side effects for new drugs for many years. That's just how it works until you have a huge population with a lot of reports to see what's happened. But there are a lot of, I think it's helped some people. I hope it helps a lot of people. And I hope that it proves not to be dangerous and doesn't have to be taken off the market. But there are a lot of troubling side effects already reported with the medicine. And I sure hope it doesn't turn out that we put so many people on it, including children, only to find out in 5 years that it's doing something kind of devastating in the big picture to the population.
uh, kids are being prescribed Ozempic for weight loss.
I don't know if it's Ozempic or Wegovy, but there has been discussion about whether children should have it and how young. And there has been advocacy for the idea of, because we have so many obese children, prescribing it to them as well. Of course, other people advocate instead, such as Robert F. Kennedy Jr., let's find out why the children are obese. And it extends, we know, beyond just the fact that children may be more sedentary today. It has to do with the food and the medicine and the other exposures they get, the stuff in our food and the ultra processed food that is known to cause things like diabetes and cancer and ADD and a lot of the things we're suffering from. But there are so many exposures in our food and environment that can contribute to this. It's hard to isolate or blame just one thing. And those are the kinds of studies that can and should be done to figure out the multi-exposures that we have causing these society-wide disorders.
Do you off the top know like the increase in some of these chronic health issues that you brought up? Like, do you know what like the increase in obesity or I guess diabetes rates have been over the past like, I don't know, 20 or 30 years?
I can't cite any figures, but I will tell you it's gone from zero in case of some disorders and diseases. They didn't even exist when I was young or even much before the time my child was born. And now they're chronic disorders. So they've come from they're brand new inventions such as POTS, juvenile diabetes. An expert told me that when he was younger, a doctor, it was so rare. He was a doctor in Great Britain that they flew in a child, I think from Australia, to show other doctors, here's a child with diabetes. It never happens. It is ultra common now. So, obviously something's happened in the past 20, 30 years that we've done to ourselves that has really changed the course of that. So that's come out of the blue, that's exploded. Obviously autism, POTS, a lot of them are autoimmune disorders, autoimmune related.
Sorry.
And so, we can trace some of that to immune system things.
Sorry, you're using a word I don't know. Are you saying POTS?
Yeah, POTS. Oh gosh, it's an acronym for I'll have to look. We'll have to look it up. But I first heard of a child having that who was a classmate of my daughter's when she was in maybe middle school. She's now 29. Now I know lots of kids, and these kids that have POTS often have many other disorders too. Celiac disease. I never had heard of that before. Now everybody's got celiac disease. Young women, so many of them have something called polycystic ovarian disorder or syndrome, PCOS or PCOD. I think that's brand new. Never heard of that when I was young. Now many women, huge percentage, have this polycystic ovarian disorder, which again, these things seem to be tied to inflammation and autoimmunity and the same sorts of things that I think can be traced to things that we've done in our diet and medicine and environment.
Just so the listeners have, I mean, you're kind of alluding to like long-term effects, and can you go through like the timeline of like a typical FDA approval? Because I know you mentioned like Viagra was linked with blindness like years later, I think. So can you give the listeners kind of an image of the FDA process? And
there was a time when it was believed, when we were all covering these stories before the media was kind of bought out by the pharmaceutical industry in the early 2000s, there was a belief that a lot of cool drugs were on the horizon, but it was taken too long to get them approved by the FDA. There may have been truth to that, but it's sort of like what's too fast, what's too slow. pressure came upon Congress, which applied pressure to the FDA to approve drugs faster. The pressure came from the pharmaceutical industry. Pharmaceutical industry pays members of Congress, and their lobbyists are up there paying members of Congress donations and so on to make these decisions. So a new deal was worked out where the FDA said, we will approve drugs faster if the pharmaceutical industry helps fund the process. That was what many people today call a deal with the devil. The fact that the FDA from that point on now thinks it works for the drug companies, because the drug companies are paying a lot of money for this approval process. And even in their internal documents, they don't call us the customer, even though they work for us, the taxpayers. They call the drug companies the clients and the stakeholders, and they share things with them and they treat them like it's all about them. And some people think it's because of this conflicted relationship where the pharmaceutical industry pays fees to the FDA. Now the FDA thinks they work for the pharmaceutical industry. But it did result in drugs being approved more quickly. And as a result of that, the timeline for clinical trials being shortened and so on, FDA scientists told me that one gave me this advice years ago when I was first covering the stories. He does not take a medicine that hasn't been on the market for 12 years because he says you won't know about the side effects until that time goes by and more people take them because not enough research is done on the front end. I would amend that by saying, if I had to take a potentially life-saving drug, I would take it, even if it hadn't been out for 12 years. But I've listened to that advice. And if someone wants to prescribe me an antibiotic, for example, which I try not to take, but if I feel like I have to have one, I now say, or if I'm taking a loved one to the doctor, what's the oldest antibiotic on the market that works for this disorder? I don't want to be the test guinea pig for a new drug that every doctor's trying to prescribe because they get, lobbied and marketed to by the drug companies. I want to take the oldest, most effective drug for the thing they're trying to fix. I think that's good advice. But in any event, drugs are approved more quickly now, but that also means we know less about them when they hit the market in terms of their safety and effectiveness.
Yeah, I agree with that advice. I guess I would just say like there's a finite amount, like you don't know what you don't know, right? So like you don't know there you can like test for there's just a battery of things that you would test for, and there can be a lot of things that you wouldn't ever see, right? So sort of to your point about 10 to 12 years, or I
Yeah,
guess the FDA scientists.
no clinical trial. So
You can't test for everything, I guess is my point.
the way the system works, it's known that the clinical trials, even the ones that are considered fairly large, first of all, they're done on typically healthy people, but people taking drugs in the real population are usually unhealthy people, or they have other disorders. So once what you do in a clinical setting of a clinical trial in a fairly short period is really nothing like what you're going to find when you actually use this drug in thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people over years. And you're looking at, does it cause cancer? Well, that's not something that's going to show up usually in 6 months. These are things that show up way down the road. And you're using this drug again in an unhealthy population, or a population that's mixing it with other medicines and has other problems wrong with them besides the thing they're taking the drug for. So yeah, there's no way to know when you first approve a drug what it's really going to cause and do. They just try to have the best information they can get in a relatively short but reasonable time among a cohort of patients that are probably not like the patients who are really going to get the drug when it's approved. It's an imperfect process, of course.
I mean, should the FDA just be abolished?
I don't think so, but it has to be, I think, by many accounts, reformed from top to bottom, where it isn't just an arm of the pharmaceutical industry, just like the CDC shouldn't just be an arm of the vaccine industry. That's all it is right now. They need to be more independent. There's been a lot of talk about this over the years. Congress doesn't make them more independent because they get so much money from the pharmaceutical and vaccine industry. The media doesn't report on it because they get so much money from the pharmaceutical and vaccine industry. So you just don't have any independent forces in there making sure the public health agencies really do their jobs. I've heard some of the proposals coming under the new Trump administration, Make America Healthy Again, by some of these people who understand, who are going to be put in these positions, like Dr. Jay Bhattacharya of Stanford, like, the guy, Dr. Martin McCary from Johns Hopkins, who's going to be in charge, I believe, of FDA. They know the things we're talking about now. They don't have the same conflicts of interest. I think they will work hard to try to change the agency and dial it back into an agency that gives guidance, that does stuff, or like the National Institutes of Health, someone said, I think Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who will head it up, it should be researching drugs that the companies don't want researched. Some people think it should be doing the independent research on all drugs, that it shouldn't be up to the drug companies to do the research. If you read my book, you'll see how slanted many of the studies are, how the studies aren't published if they come out wrong, how they lie in the studies at times about their results. So there's a feeling that isn't that what the government ought to be doing, is the independent work, so that we can trust and believe the research that's coming out. So I don't think the FDA needs to be abolished, but I think there needs to be top to bottom reform of all these agencies.
Well, I guess so you just brought up the media. I guess in the book you make a lot of sort of something I never thought about how so much of the, I guess, commercial space goes to pharmaceutical companies, which is something I never, I mean, I don't think I like cognitively noticed it, but after reading, I did notice how such a large percentage of them are pharma commercials. I guess, can you talk a little bit about what it was like reporting on some of this stuff under those conditions?
Well, how old are you guys?
I just turned 34.
I'm 35.
So you probably don't remember a time, you haven't thought much about it, you said, but in your lifetime, we've just been inundated with pharmaceutical ads. But in my lifetime, when I was younger, they were banned, like they are in almost every country. Prescription drugs were not allowed to be advertised on TV and in the media, because it was thought that this very thing might happen. It would lead to lots of conflicts, that people would try to prescribe themselves what they ought to have, and that should be what doctors do. But of course, the pharmaceutical industry partnered with the media. I didn't know this until years later when I was reporting at CBS News. The reason I started getting pushback on stories I was assigned to cover about pharmaceutical scandals, but this was a time when we were starting to make money, because this was a new thing. We were starting to make money off the pharmaceutical ads, lots of money. And all of a sudden there was pushback from other corners of CBS over some of these popular stories that I was assigned to cover. I now know in retrospect that at the corporate level, CBS lobbyists, corporate lobbyists, were working side by side with pharmaceutical industry lobbyists on Capitol Hill, trying to make the case for loosening of the rules so that there could be more advertising on TV and in the media. And they won. And once that arrangement was solidified, that's when you can look back temporally and see that the media quit being serious about covering these stories that everybody was covering because they were so important, these big scandals. And I think the pharmaceutical and vaccine industry partly understood what was happening. There was a lot of momentum in the early 2000s before the drug advertising was so pervasive. A lot of movement on the part of news organizations and members of Congress to do something about dangerous drugs that had been approved, about profit motive overtaking safety, and so on. The industry saw this, and I believe they understood that if they bought lots of ads, and it's not just buying ads, there's all kinds of relationships they have with media that are financial, but contributed to members of Congress, that they could make it where the news didn't want to cover these stories. And in effect, that's exactly what happened.
Well, one other surprising thing in the book you brought up is the pharmaceutical company's involvement actually in the medical schools through books and, I guess, free lunches. And can you walk through that dynamic?
I'll just give one example. There's so many, but I think this is really a great way for people to understand why their doctors treat them the way they do, in a way that really doesn't make sense for your health sometimes. Starting in medical school, one of the most popular references for med students is called the Merck manuals, written by the vaccine maker pharmaceutical company, Merck. And to me, it's wild that med schools would rely upon, it would be allowed for a drug company to make this reference book that so many people rely upon. And they say, well, you know, it's firewalled. Our editors that write this stuff, you know, for the med students have nothing to do with the company, you know, where we sell the drugs. And by the way, have settled multi-billions of dollars in fraud charges for mismarketing medicine, lying about medicine, fraud in medicine, bribing doctors. That has nothing to do with the arm that writes the textbook. So we're to believe there's this firewall. put up by this company that's has been found to be dishonest in its marketing and so on in the past. But I wanted to see what the Merck manuals teaches young budding doctors about its own scandals, such as the HPV Gardasil vaccine, which is very controversial, has tons of side effects. Its co-inventor, who worked for Merck, actually came out when the vaccine was being marketed and told me that the vaccine is riskier than the disease it purports to prevent, even if it worked, which is cervical cancer. So what does exactly the Merck manual tell doctors about Gardasil vaccine? I look in there and it said, no serious adverse events have been reported. And I couldn't believe it. I almost choked. Well, first of all, they all have serious adverse events reported. That's just part of doing business. But you can look at the leaflet, or you can go online for the vaccine for HPV, for Gardasil, at what's been approved and written by Merck. And it has everything from side effects reported from paralysis to death to brain problems. But it's telling doctors wrongly, it's lying, that there are no, serious side effects reported. So then your doctor goes on, because all he's been told in med school is that vaccines are the greatest invention since drinking water. I've heard that parroted so many times to me, and that there's no side effects, or they're not told to monitor for them. Why should they? There's no side effects. So they don't watch for it. They don't report them. Well, since that book came out, and I've been talking about this, Merck has deleted that passage from their online version of the Merck manuals. They no longer say there's no serious side effects, but did they put in there what the side effects are? No, they just skipped that altogether. So they're still being dishonest with young doctors. So this is just one of many examples, but what I'm saying is it explains why doctors end up going into practice with a misconception about drugs and side effects and vaccines, and look at you like you have two heads if you've done your reading, or if you've seen studies that show things they don't know about.
This is sort of I guess, a training question, but do you know if there's a difference between like the training at DO schools versus MD schools? And I guess this is somewhat anecdotal, but the doctors that I know that went through DO programs all tend to talk about medicine in a much different way than the doctors I know that went through MD programs.
Absolutely. And I haven't studied this. I'll just tell you my experience. My brother actually graduated from a doctor of osteopath DO school, osteopathic medicine. And I know I accidentally went to one. I didn't know the difference when I was young. And there is absolutely a different way that those doctors treat you. But I think that's where medicine is going. They're now calling it functional medicine, root cause medicine. People are seeking out doctors that do want to spend a few minutes and try to find what's the cause of the disorder, not just what kind of medicine can I take to try to relieve my symptoms. And that's more what DOs seem to be about. Their whole medical training is less, just drug focused and drug oriented, and more toward the whole body and learning how the systems work together. Makes so much sense. But again, I think that's the new trend, particularly post-COVID.
Wait, you think more people are going into DO schools now, or that's like the trend in how people want to be treated?
How people want to be treated, and how doctors
Okay.
are breaking away from the medicine the way they used to practice and going more in that direction. Now, they may not be DOs. They may do, like I said, functional medicine, root cause medicine. There's a third name for that type, but more people are seeking that, and more doctors since COVID have broken away from the traditional practice of medicine. I've met and interviewed many of them that were all in on the old system until COVID, when they saw they weren't allowed to treat their patients the way that they thought was best, or the way that they always had thought they should treat patients before. They thought the system was broken. Now, suddenly they're looking into all kinds of different ways in a broken medical system as they see it, to better treat patients and figure out what's wrong with them, rather than just, put them in a box. One doctor refers to it as silos. You go to one doctor for this, another doctor for that. They don't talk to each other. They don't cross over. But a lot of the disorders people have cross over into many different systems in the body, and you're not going to fix them if you're just having one each doctor you go to look at a little teeny piece of it and give you a different medicine for it. So the trend now, I believe, and this is partly based on everybody I run into and people I know, they're telling me, I found this great doctor who practices functional medicine who finally figured out X for me. So many people are finding these types of doctors practicing this sort of medicine on their own.
I guess speaking of COVID, I mean, you mentioned a lot of like crazy COVID stories. What's the craziest COVID story you can tell the listeners?
Maybe one of the craziest ones is the CDC falsely put out a story very early on, a directive signed by all their experts on vaccines that said the initial studies on the COVID vaccine showed that even if you already had COVID, the vaccine helped, which is false. The studies showed the opposite. And when that was discovered by Congressman Thomas Massey, who was researching should he have the shot after he'd already had COVID, natural immunity, and he saw that they misrepresented the studies. And it went down this crazy road of him recording CDC officials first denying and then acknowledging he was right, but pretending like, oh, how did you find our error? How did we not see this? And all of our 12 experts who all signed the paper, how did this fabricated claim appear out of nowhere? And we all signed it. And him trying to convince them to fix the error is almost like a comedy show. I aired the audio recordings on my program Full Measure, but they're basically saying, well, if we correct the error, it'll really confuse people. And he's like, you got to correct the error. And they finally agreed to correct the error. But by the way, after acknowledging it was wrong, I don't use the word lie very much because lie requires knowing someone's intent. So I will just say mistake or misstatement. We know this was a lie because the very CDC officials and doctors that had admitted to him on the telephone he was right, the studies didn't show that there was any benefit to getting vaccinated if you've already had COVID. The next day or two, there was a webinar with those same officials telling doctors the lie that they had acknowledged isn't true to him. They're still feeding that out to doctors in a webinar. So at this point, we know this misinformation is on purpose. And then when they finally, Congressman Massey is pressing and pressing them to change it. When they finally make the fix, they rewrote it to make it sound pretty much like the same thing they'd already said with a lot of jabberwocky. So, I believe a reasonable theory is the vaccine industry writes all of that stuff. The advisors never looked at the studies. They just signed the paper because if they had looked as much as I had looked or Congressman Massey looked, they would understand what they were signing was false. Why aren't they reading the studies that they're signing papers about and telling the public about? The vaccine industry is writing that stuff, handing it to CDC. CDC rubber stamps it and then does not want to correct it because that would have really, at a time when so many people had had COVID, think of the market that would have cut into for the vaccine if everybody who had COVID decided it was not a great benefit to get the vaccine if you had COVID. And most people were getting COVID, that would have really, cut into profits.
Yeah, I vaguely remember like hearing somewhere that your natural immunity only lasted like 2 weeks or something, which I mean, this is obviously going back a whiles now, but I remember thinking that's really not, well, one, not good, and two, like different than every other like disease or virus you're taught about in like just, university biology classes.
Yeah,
I think
if that had been the case, as you say, this would have been the first virus in the history of man that ever behaved that way. And no one who knew anything about it that I trusted, because they've been right about their sourcing and their information, thought that natural immunity only lasted 2 weeks. All of them thought natural immunity would prove to be, as it usually does or always is, longer lasting and more powerful than what you could generate with a vaccine and without the side effects.
I think there's a good clip of I think it's Rand Paul. That's the senator from Kentucky, right? Jack, correct?
Yeah.
I think like him yelling at Fauci essentially over this same topic for like 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, well, he's a doctor, so Rand Paul
Right.
actually, understands,
What he's talking about.
yeah, this basic stuff that a lot of people maybe don't, and was able to argue the point to some degree. But, even Dr. Fauci early on said natural immunity would be a huge, powerful force in this disease, and then abandoned that. And it was mostly, as I was watching, just a layperson almost, I was just stunned by they wouldn't even talk about natural immunity, because then they'd have to lie about it. If they wanted you to think there wasn't any, they just simply didn't put it as part of the equation, and the media wasn't asking the questions about it. They would just say you needed the vaccine, and no one was asking sort of the natural immunity question, which they should have been. In the very beginning, again, using cognitive dissonance, I never understood. Do you guys remember in those early press conferences Trump was giving every day, the press was going, why aren't there more tests? There should be more tests, test more people. Why aren't there more COVID? And I kept going at home. How does more testing help anything? Like, it doesn't stop the virus. It doesn't really mean anything. And you're capturing a bunch of people who have it asymptomatically, meaning they have no symptoms. At the time, CDC said most people would probably get it with no symptoms. All it served to do, I'm thinking at home, is scare people and make them think they needed help. I thought if there's any kind of test we should be giving, let's put a bunch of tests out to see who's already have it, like a T cell test. There's a way to see, was I infected and I didn't know it? Because those people with some natural immunity could keep society open. You don't have to shut down society if you have a population of people who've had COVID, many of them without symptoms, and have some natural immunity. You don't have to wait for the vaccine or waste the vaccine on them. But nobody was talking about that. They just wanted more people tested with a COVID test. And I just kept thinking at home, like, are they thinking about what they're asking for and the logic behind why testing more people helps anything?
Well, I guess to be fair, I don't think a lot of lay people would know about T cell tests to like even really be aware that you could do something like that.
Well, no, but so that should have been the focus of the public health agencies if they weren't, in my view, corrupt. They shouldn't have been out there screaming. They were pushing the public health
Oh, the
agencies.
public health agencies were
Yeah,
doing it.
but the
Sorry.
media was carrying their water without doing critical thinking. So the media, after the public health agencies and Dr. Fauci are saying Trump should have more tests, the media's like, why aren't there more tests? And nobody's thinking, what is more tests helping with? They should have been able to say, and Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, when I kind of gave this theory to him after the fact, he's like, you're absolutely right. You know, the natural immunity question would have been far more helpful at this stage. And he actually, so Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who will be heading NIH at Stanford, was off the narrative and saying the shutdowns are going to be harmful and won't work, and started something called the Great Barrington Declaration, signed on by tens of thousands of scientists saying don't shut down society. I came across him very early because he and his team surveys in California trying to find out how many people had already had COVID. And he was doing that work with the understanding that that was, you know, far more valuable to know than this idea of who'd had COVID for the purposes of having some natural immunity, which was far better than finding out who at the moment passed a COVID test or not. The other thing about the COVID test, as you guys know, the COVID test tells you in that moment in time, do you have enough COVID in you to make the test positive? You could test negative and 5 minutes later have COVID, you know, just not, you didn't have the virus level 5 minutes before the threshold to test positive. So any test is only good literally for that moment and not good an hour later, not good a day later. So again, the notion that the COVID tests were really helping us do much of anything just made no sense.
Well, there was also a massive problem, I think, with the PCR tests that they were amplifying it so much that I feel like there were a real lot of false positives, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, I never studied that, but people I trust were all over that notion that you can make a test like that and cycles or however that works so sensitive that you can find whatever you want to find, you know, in any sample if you make your protocols a certain way.
Yeah, I don't exactly remember, but the amplification process for the PCR, I think, was overblown. Maybe I vaguely remember that. So going back to your point about the committee acknowledging that you don't need the vaccine, like privately, if you've had the natural immunity, but then like recanting or essentially to the public saying you should still take it. I mean, that is, to me, that's essentially saying like the committee is corrupt, correct? Like, I mean, that's I guess the uncharitable take. I guess you could say something like for public morale, like you want everyone to take it, you just need to go through this narrative. But I guess I don't know, can you like take that to anyone? Can you bring any type of like legal suit for that or have these people like, I guess, fired? I mean, I would personally want them fired for that.
Well, the idea that nobody was held accountable and nobody even cared shows that this was intentional. And yes, it's corrupt. there should be an inquiry as to how 11 or 12 of the FDA's top vaccine advisors signed on to an advisory for the public that was wrong, that contained false information. Are they not doing their job? They should all be fired, in my view, as well as the heads of the departments and bodies that perpetuated this false information. But the fact that nobody's held accountable, I mean, isn't this the story of our public health agencies and to some extent our federal agencies in general? If media is not holding them accountable and Congress isn't doing anything about it, who's going to? And that's the hope, that if you finally have some independent people in positions, some of that will happen. I mean, if the people who are named to be in charge of these agencies now, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. told me he knows exactly who he would walk down the halls and fire at CDC. He's litigated against these people successfully as an attorney, and he understands where the corruption is and who the players are. And I think there's an expectation and a hope that some of this systemic stuff that's been in there for decades will get rooted out.
So in the book, you analyzed a group of people that didn't shut down. What can you tell the listeners about the Mormon people and how they approached COVID?
Very interesting, because wouldn't everybody want to know? If the government really wanted to know the difference, there's a population. It's actually the Amish who did not follow the CDC protocols, and Associated Press or a couple other places were first to report before I did that they had supposedly achieved herd immunity. All that means is they let it run through the population, and therefore with natural immunity, didn't have to worry about it anymore. Well, there's truth to that. So I went and visited and found that instead of resisting COVID or trying to stop it, which was impossible anyway, they let it run through at breakneck speed. They weren't denying COVID, that phrase, COVID deniers. They just let everybody, they let it run its course. And it ran through rather quickly in the largest Amish population in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in 2020, when they had a big church ceremony where everybody drinks out of the same cup. They all drank out of the same cup. They all think they got COVID. Nobody tested for it. So there's not hard data because they don't test. They don't care. They're like, we know we had COVID. Why test for COVID? They don't go to the hospital. They don't get vaccinated. They don't mask. They didn't shut down. And, lo and behold, they made more money as a society than they've ever made by staying open. And I would argue they suffered fewer deaths and injuries. The whole point of not shutting down would be, did you suffer more injuries, fewer injuries and deaths or not? Well, if you suffered no more deaths and didn't shut down and didn't spend money on vaccines and medical care and hospitals and experiment on everybody with the vaccines and lose money and shut down your schools, isn't it better? That's the question. Of course it is. So I did the story about how they let it run through and got supposed herd immunity. And interestingly, a government study comes out, a government-funded study shortly after that looks to me like they're trying to disparage the Amish approach based on the title. It said something about, made people think there was like this horrible danger of the crazy religious people who didn't shut down, how dangerous that was. So I knew that wasn't true. I look at the study and I see that they've done all kinds of inappropriate things to come to their conclusions. One thing they did was they mixed in Amish people with Mennonite people to say there were just as many deaths in the population than the non-Amish population. The problem is the Amish people are very different from Mennonite. The Mennonites largely followed CDC rules. So you're grouping in, you're watering down your Amish population by throwing in Mennonites who did follow CDC rules and vaccinate, and then saying as a whole, they suffered as many deaths as everybody else, so therefore their approach didn't work. That was one problem. Number two, would you believe the study did not study Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the largest Amish population in the country? Why? Why did they exclude Lancaster, Pennsylvania from their study when that was kind of the whole point of, the stories that have been done? Well, I believe if they had included Lancaster, PA, they wouldn't have gotten the numbers they wanted to get. And then thirdly, they buried the headline, because even with what I would call manipulation of their study to try to make it look as bad as they could for the Amish, their takeaway was the Amish suffered a similar death rate as the population that did shut down. My takeaway is, are you kidding me? They didn't do anything you said that they had to do and they suffered no more deaths. That's the headline, that their approach was superior. How is that not your takeaway? So I challenged the study. I've done this several times, and it took the study journal over a year until after my book was published. And then they finally issued several corrections to the study based on my complaint about it. Now, just like I said, when CDC issued its correction of their false information about the COVID vaccine, the correction of this study didn't make clear what was really wrong with it. They've left the title up there that gives misinformation, in my view. But at least they had to go through the embarrassment and the re-examination of the study. I use that to say, I think today many studies that we hear of, especially federally funded, are used as narratives. They're manipulated to try to put out something they want the public to believe that may not be true. And they're using our taxpayer money to do it. And then if you as a journalist, or even if you as a citizen, try to get the information like, who was really behind this study, this federally funded study? What did the emails say about what this study needed to show? They suddenly say, well, you can't have that information. Like it's not available to you under Freedom of Information law. You can't know who the peer reviewers are, because the peer reviewers should have caught what I caught. I'm just a layperson. Who are the peer reviewers that rubber stamp this? Well, you can't know that either. That's a secret. So all the stuff that you would need to know in a study that we paid for that impacts us, they keep secret. I mean, that's how broken the system is.
I mean, also like sort of to the narrative point, like corrections in journals really don't mean, I don't think no one cares about the correction, right? Like the only thing that matters is what's published first, and then no one reads the corrections.
There was a famous case of Dr. Eric Pullman, who was the first doctor I think anybody knew of who was put in prison for fraud when a med student that was working for him caught him doctoring numbers on some important studies involving hormone replacement therapy in women. This is years ago in Vermont. And the med student was kind of threatened, don't talk. And, the doctor wasn't going to correct his studies and so on. Eventually, the med student got somebody to care. The doctor got prosecuted. A bunch of studies got corrected. But when it had been looked at later, at the time I did this story for CBS some years later, and I even looked more recently, first of all, some of the studies that were supposed to be retracted were still out there. They hadn't been. No one had followed up to make sure the studies were retracted. Second of all, like you say, they remain in the domain. No researcher who hears this amazing research and they're passing it on thinks they should go back 4 years later. I wonder if that research is still true. I should go look up that paper and see if there's any corrections. Like you say, that doesn't happen. So the false information tends to persist.
Right. And then especially from like a narrative perspective, once the narrative's taken hold, no one's going to then retroactively like change their mind, I guess. Or at least most people won't. I guess there's probably someone that would.
And another way studies are used, if a good study comes out, meaning an honest, truthful study that looks bad for a medicine, there are huge money interests that can come up with all kinds of studies to put out that confuse the matter, that either say the opposite or say something confusing, or you can put out 10 of those for every one honest study that's funded, because there's a lot more money held by the pharmaceutical industry. And so all of a sudden, when people search, maybe they say, oh, this, I thought this bad thing came out about a medicine, but look, there's 10 studies that say that was all wrong. But in today's environment, all of that stuff can be created and manipulated. So it's not necessarily true, the picture that you're getting as a patient or that your doctor's getting when he reads these studies.
I think go ahead.
I was just going to say to that point, like, how do you ascertain like what is true? Like when you're looking through this, because I mean, I feel like everyone struggles with this, like reading through, all these news articles about anything. It just seems like I can find, one article that says, something and another news article that says the exact opposite. Like, how do you ascertain what is right?
Well, and that's the point. So the ones that want to confuse, if they can do nothing more than confuse you, they've done their job. If they can get you not to listen to the thing they don't want you to believe in. I think I gave some pretty good tips, because that's a vexing question. But at the end of the book, some of the strategies I use as a journalist, why I've not had to retract any of my, I'm I'm going to knock on wood because even great journalists occasionally make mistakes and have to retract or correct their stories. I haven't over the course of all the controversies I've covered, but part of that is being able to divine good sources, good, reliable sources amid this sea of information and misinformation. And I have some strategies and follow the science for how people can do that. But one easy one, it'll sound kind of obvious. We have a track record now with COVID, for example. So I could fairly quickly, I didn't know in the beginning who was going to be right about all the stuff they were saying about COVID, but fairly quickly I could start to look and see in retrospect who was right about things. And those are the sources I then would go to in the future. If Dr. Jay Bhattacharya tells me something now, I'm far more likely to listen to him than, for example, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who proved wrong and conflicted on so many things. So sometimes it's as simple as identifying some key sources, whether it's publication or people that are writing and reporting on this. And that's who I would tend to give probably more credence to when I'm researching a topic. I think a giant red flag, and I say this in the book as well, is when so many in the mainstream media are on the same narrative. That should be your red flag to say, if they're telling you something's true and that something else is not true and you shouldn't believe the other thing, and they don't even want to give voice to it, or they want to censor it or controversialize it, I tend to think there's truth to the opposite of what they're saying, because that's borne out to be true so many times in today's conflicted environment. When you hear everybody on the same page, interviewing the same experts, using the same words and phrases, that's not organic. News organizations shouldn't be that similar. If they're all just independent news organizations, you would have more organic and differences and, variety. So when it's all the same, you as a consumer should think, boy, there's somebody really powerful that's able to coordinate this message. And I wonder why they want it to say this. And I wonder what it is they don't want me to know. And as a journalist, that's how I find some of my best stories, is asking who wants me to believe that and why.
I thought another great thing you did, and I asked basically my question, but you also do a good job like connecting dots and looking up the IRS like public forums. Can you talk through like how you even thought to do that, or and maybe how one would also utilize some of those same tactics?
Give that example again.
I was just talking about like how you like search for conflicts of interest through IRS public forums.
Oh, yeah. Well, it wasn't exactly through IRS forms, but I know what you're talking about. I looked at, yeah, some of it is. They're called Form 990s. And just as a journalist, I learned to look up, a producer said this to me as a joke, but there's truth to the joke, that almost every nonprofit that says it's one thing actually does the opposite. So, the Bureau for Patient Safety for patients taking drug XYZ is probably started by a drug company making XYZ, who wants to have journalists go there as a resource and think none of these safety issues are true because that's what it says. My instincts have kicked in, and 100% of the time when I've actually looked at their IRS Form 990s, I can find they're funded by the drug company or a PR firm that represents the drug company. Now they're getting a little more clever about how to legally launder the relationship so it's not so easy to see. But another thing I do, I thought you were talking about, when I first was assigned to cover these medical controversies, and I would have doctors referred, the government would, or the drug company would say, we don't want to do an interview, but interview this independent doctor to defend this medicine. And I would think, why would an independent doctor, when there are legitimate questions, be so willing to just get behind a drug like, there's nothing wrong with this drug, it can't possibly be true. And so as a suspicion, I did start using the Google machine to cross-reference and see if these doctors had relationships with the drug companies. And 100% of the time, these independent doctors were getting paid by the drug company that was referring me to them, 100% of the time. And I started going, why don't the medical reporters, I'm not a medical reporter, I'm an investigative reporter. Why don't the beat reporters ask this question? They're holding out these same experts. I'm watching TV and seeing another channel pretending they're independent and not disclosing their financial conflicts of interest, like Dr. Paul Offit at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, like he's some independent doctor on vaccines. He's made untold millions from Merck for inventing a vaccine. And he's defending the vaccine that has safety issues, with some people on TV putting him on there, not saying, by the way, he made the vaccine he's defending. I have an example of that in the book. So there's all kinds of ways to look for conflicts of interest. They're pervasive. And like you say, yes, the IRS tax forms is one thing you can do, but also just looking at financial disclosures that doctors have made, or conferences they've spoken at where they've been hired by the drug companies and paid money to speak at a conference. I would find old, conference leaflets and speaking engagements and that type of thing.
Yeah, I guess the question I have, I mean, the conflicts of interest you brought up in the book, I thought were incredibly egregious. Like, how is that legal? How can you pay someone and then say call them an independent doctor?
It shouldn't be because, I think that's part of the systemic problem. The medical associations should not permit that, but they are wholly captured as well by the pharmaceutical industry. For example, drug companies paid in part for the headquarters for the American Medical Association when they built a new headquarters in Chicago. And when I asked, they wouldn't tell me how much money the drug companies paid, but I was able to track down some of it. Why? First of all, why are you taking money from the drug companies? Second of all, why won't you say how much it is? But the medical associations that dictate ethics for doctors are saying all this stuff is okay. They should be stepping in, and having professional rules of ethics for these sorts of things. When it comes to the crossover into the public domain, because a lot of the stuff impacts the public, Congress should surely be making sure the FDA enforces rules and so on, so that type of thing can't happen. But again, the whole system has been co-opted.
What can we be optimistic about going forward, Cheryl?
I do have reason for optimism. I think that COVID was so bad that the censorship and the things we've talked about that were kind of invisible to most people, a lot of people saw it for the first time. There were people who never considered themselves activists of any kind, but then kind of used their thinking cap, never thought about vaccines, just got their vaccines and didn't really think about what they could do. Suddenly, the reaction and the mandates were so outlandish that people who hadn't given much thought to it became activists, and doctors in the mainstream who hadn't given much thought about it are now reconsidering everything that they were taught. And they're starting new bodies, new groups. FLCCC is one of them. I'm talking about thousands of doctors are getting on board with the idea that we need to reform the system and practice medicine in a different way that makes us healthier, not sicker. So I just think there's a big awareness awakening that's happened that's going to be positive overall. And with, I don't know how far the Make America Healthy Again crowd will get, because this stuff is so entrenched in our federal agencies and they know how to just wait 4 years until new people come in if they don't like what the president's doing. But this is the most hope I have, or I've seen in my lifetime, that some of this corruption might be able to be addressed and rooted out.
Well, we're coming up about an hour, but one of the last things I wanted to bring up to you is I was listening to you talk on a different interview, and you brought up that the government hacked your computer. Can, can,
Yeah, I mean, gosh.
can you talk about that a little bit? That sounds, I mean, it sounds sort of scary, honestly. Like when I was hearing you talk about it, I was like, man, I would be scared if I found out that this was happening to me.
It was very creepy because at the time this happened to me, I was covering a lot of scandals under the Obama administration for CBS News, but I'd also covered scandals under Republican administrations. I'd covered pharmaceutical scandals, a lot of corporate scandals. But two sources who didn't know each other from intelligence community, and I didn't know very well, came up to me during a time period and separately said, "You're probably being monitored because of the work that you do." We knew nothing back then. This is before we knew about Edward Snowden and the spying on journalists. So it sounded, I said, "Well, what do you mean being monitored?" They said, "Your computers." Sounded crazy and far-fetched to me. It never had occurred to me that something like that would be happening. Through a series of events I won't go into in great detail here, but my first book, Stonewalled, the book starts with this story and has a lot of, I think, pretty fascinating detail about the forensics and so on. But I was able to have contacts and resources that forensically proved very quickly that I had been subject to a long-term monitoring effort by the government. We have IP addresses and irrefutable forensic proof that shows the government was doing this. But of course, I knew it wasn't just me. I may have been one of a handful of top national reporters covering this sort of thing, but if they were doing this to me, logic told me they were doing this to other journalists and perhaps other citizens. We now know that's absolutely true. I just happened to be able to find out about it. Some months went by as we continued to investigate and get more evidence. There's been now 6 or 7 forensics that have gotten more and more information about what they were doing, including accessing the whole CBS system, not just my computers, a keystroke monitoring program. They were able to activate the program Skype secretly, whereas I wouldn't even know it was on, but it was on my computer, but they could listen to my conversations in the room without the computer even looking like that Skype was being used or was on. All kinds of things. They also planted 3 classified documents deep in the BIOS operating system of my computer, someplace I wouldn't even know existed, but the forensics sources that I had were able to see that. So this was pretty scary. CBS finally publicly announced this, that the computers had been hacked. We'd had these intrusions and didn't really do anything about it after that. So I embarked upon a personal lawsuit that's still going on because Department of Justice, despite the irrefutable evidence, will not say who ordered it or admit to it. They're just sort of fighting to make sure this doesn't go to trial, spending untold taxpayer money. My attorney has not billed me for most of it. I've been billed for several $100,000 in pursuit of just accountability, but I'm sure there's a bill somewhere for over $1 million because this has been going on for 10 years. But since then, we know that they've done this to members of Congress and their staff. There's a new scandal about that out this week, that even Kash Patel, the upcoming FBI director, was spied on by Department of Justice when he was a congressional staffer doing oversight of the Department of Justice. And I think these scandals continued. Donald Trump was spied on through the Carter Page illegal wiretap applications. They continue because no one's held accountable. Why would they stop? Starting back with me, and I'm sure it dates even longer ago than that, but if no one's going to hold them accountable, why wouldn't they spy on citizens and journalists?
Yeah, it's Orwellian.
It is.
I guess, Jack, do you have any final questions?
I think so. Sharyl, thanks so much for coming on. Why don't you tell the listeners where they can go get your book or get in touch with you?
Well, Follow the Science is for sale anywhere. It's a 5-star Amazon bestseller. Thank you.
Very good.
I try to cross-post most of my stuff. My TV show is Full Measure. You can see replays at fullmeasure.news, but I try to repost almost everything at SharylAttkisson.com because I have a Substack. I have just 2 podcasts, the Sharyl Attkisson podcast and Full Measure After Hours. I have a lot of stuff going on. I try to put it all at SharylAttkisson.com.
Awesome.
Okay. With that said, please reach out to us at brothersonbooks@gmail.com for any book recommendations, or if you'd like to be a guest host for a particular book you have in mind. A great review or rating on whichever platform you're listening to would be greatly appreciated. And lastly, if you can think of any friend, family member, or coworker that might like this episode, please pass it along. I'm Alex Allweil, and with me as always is my brother Jack Allweil. And today we had special guest Sharyl Attkisson. Thank you so much for coming on. And Jack, what book are we doing next?
We are reading, I don't have it right by me, but it's From Hamas to America.
Should be a good one.
Should be a good one. Till next time.